today I'm welcoming Carolyn Barr to the podcast to talk bias and sustainability. Now, Carolyn is a passionate and driven entrepreneur and sustainability advocate, and she brought those together back in 2020 when she founded Susgain. Now, Susgain is a B Corp certified social enterprise on a mission to connect eco and socially conscious stakeholders to create mutual impact. And they do this through having created a rewards-based mobile app designed to help drive sustainable behavioral change within communities through plug-and-play engagement campaigns, and then whilst measuring the impact on the other side. Now, before setting up Susgain, Carolyn worked in an HR consulting and change management firm. And it's at the intersection of sustainability and change management that I first came across Carolyn late last year when she delivered a TEDx talk. And the topic was overcoming cognitive bias in sustainability. Now, so much of what Carolyn shared just joined the dots between many of the topics that we've covered with previous guests on this podcast when it comes to how we address and overcome some of the biases that stop us from being the best version of ourselves. And so these are the topics I'm delighted to get stuck into with Carolyn and have her share more on her expertise and personal experiences in this space. So Carolyn, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Dashi. I'm really excited to be here with you. Thank you.
So Carolyn, first of all, can you share with us, in your words, your journey from change management and HR to entrepreneurship and sustainability? And I'd love to hear some of those personal biases that you had to overcome in making that transition.
Perfect, sure. So my journey in sustainability started, I would say, on a personal level. So my husband and I, we wanted to adopt the most sustainable lifestyle, especially after having our daughter some 10 years ago. We also spent some time abroad, and then we returned to Singapore in 2017. And that's really when I couldn't help noticing changes from before I've left. So for example, hawker centers that we used to go to, they used to serve their food in reusables. Now it was replaced by single-use disposables. And that was also the time where there was the rise of online shopping, delivery platforms, and suddenly there was a lot of packaging waste around us. Yeah. And even on my personal level, I noticed, so me and my colleagues, we work in CBD and we would grab lunch downstairs, bring it back to the office, eat it. And after every lunch break, there was this huge amount of waste in our pantry. And it was really quite terrible to see. So this really sparked my conversation with one of my former colleagues, Alia. How could we do things differently? So we started on a very, again, small scale effort. So we began introducing recycling bins in our office. We encouraged our colleagues to bring reusable lunch boxes. We organized some sustainability awareness talks. But then it quickly became clear to me that actually sustainability wasn't only an environmental challenge, but it was really a change management challenge. Because what I saw is that actually most people in my surrounding, my colleagues, friends, family member, we all agreed that, yes, we want to do more. And it's a good idea to, reduce waste and adopt more sustainable habits and all of it. But despite our good intentions, we all struggled to turn them into lasting habits. And so this realization ultimately sparked my journey from change management and HR into sustainability and entrepreneurship, because I just was intrigued to see what can we do, or how can we use behavior science, technology to make sustainable actions easier, more rewarding, and more impactful at scale?
Yeah, it's really interesting that making that connection between something having to change and understanding for all impact-driven organizations, the behavioral piece is so important. And there was something, Carolyn, that you raised in your TEDx talk that really resonated with me, where you drew out something called the intention action gap. And again, I've found that in my world so much, that whether it's culture change in a workplace, whether it's environmental sustainability, most people have that intention and will not dispute the fact that something has to change. They may share that they feel unsatisfied with the way things are, but it's such a big jump from, going from that to actually taking action. So I really would like you to explain a bit more about what this intention action gap is. And also, I'm really curious as to what, for you, out of all of your, colleagues and everyone having the same experience, say in your office, for example, why or what was it in you that could drive the action above everyone else?
Sure. So I think, the action, as you already mentioned, the intention action gap is something that we all feel, right? It's whether you want to exercise more regularly. We talked about maybe recycling being difficult, or even any personal goals you have, right? We all have these New Year's resolutions and they're already known for not being fulfilled, right? So it's ultimately talking about the gap that we have between what we want to do and what we actually do. And so in the context of sustainability, I think, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people identify themselves with the idea of reducing waste, supporting ethical choices. But then when it comes to translating these good intentions into everyday habits or actions, things get in our way. So typically you find that it's not as convenient as we need it to be. There's a lack of time, right? We don't know where to get started. And this is really where I would say behavioral science comes in, because instead of just expecting people to say, hey, try harder, you can do it, we need to rethink and redesign our surrounding, right? The systems, incentives, environments, so that we naturally guide people towards action rather than just expecting them to just magically overcome this. So sometimes I remember, for example, on a personal note, that when we started introducing those reusable lunch containers in the office, and I started bringing down my reusable container for the first time to a hawker stall, I had like really absurd concerns. So I used to buy some food and the hawker stall would give it to me in a round Tupperware box, like a single-use one. But then I came with a square one. And in my mind, I was thinking like, is this going to be okay? Because the shape of the container is different. And now I can laugh about it. But I think there is this kind of, like things that make it harder for us. And once you try, and in my case, actually, I was positively surprised that the hawker was actually welcoming me to bring my own box, because effectively this is saving him money, right?
Yes.
So then you normalize this behavior and it becomes so normal. And now I would never even question, like what kind of shape my box has. But these are things that we just have to experience first to get over it.
Yeah, and that's so important to share, because sometimes I think, particularly with these topics where there is such a strong intention as well as the gap that exists, that there can always be a bit of shame around not wanting to admit all of the potentially even banal reasons that our brains have just come up with to take that path of least resistance and just think, oh, this is kind of in the too hard basket for now. But when we're talking about that behavioral science piece, we talk a lot about, pushing ourselves to overcome the biases that stop us from doing things. But what have you learned about what biases we can actually use to our advantage and almost create a tailwind that makes it easier, particularly when it's about getting started and getting that wheel turning?
That's an interesting question, actually, because I think biases will always be surrounded by biases. That's inevitable. But I think it's about how we can leverage them instead of having them work against us. A few examples that came to mind is like, for example, the status quo bias. And I think this is linking back to making sustainable choices the default choices and not the difficult choices. Yeah. So, for example, imagine you're going to a restaurant and the vegetarian meal choices are the default. You are allowing people to choose the meat. Or imagine in an airline, right? The carbon offset fee is already included in the price, and you are asking the passengers to opt out instead of opting in. So these are small changes that actually can really help to, help us to tackle this status quo bias, because the status quo is already set as the default and most sustainable choice. Another example that I thought of is the social proof, or we actually call it also the FOMO bias, right? So
Yes.
oftentimes we are really very much driven by other people's behaviors. And so imagine you do a steps competition with your colleagues. Of course, you don't want to be the last one, or you don't want to be the one that's, like not supporting your team. So whether you really like to walk a lot or not, you're just going to do it just for that reason. And so we can actually also, when we want to engage communities, leverage that and have you not fight on your own, but do it together as a team.
Okay, so I love this idea of actually taking those steps to change the status quo, because so often people can use a status quo to put them off doing something in the first place. So take me through, for Susgain, like what have you seen to have worked? How does Susgain work to kind of trigger those biases in a way that people receive rewards for acting in a
Sure.
sustainable
Yes.
way?
Yes. So I think in our case at Saskin, really whatever we are doing has been changing over the time, but it's always evolving around this core mission. How can we actually bridge this intention action gap? And so we are trying to provide tools, incentives, and nudges that help you adopt those right habits. And so what I can share is maybe a few nudges or strategies that can help us bridge the gap, and then how we try to incorporate this into our platform as well. So for example, the first one would be making things more easy and more convenient. And because as we said, oftentimes the inconvenience is really what stops us from getting started. Locally here, for example, in Singapore, we actually have quite a lot of recycling infrastructure, but people are not aware of it. And because of that, the recyclables, let's say, for example, textiles or e-waste, end up in the general waste bin because people don't know where to go. And so to address this, we, for example, mapped out this recycling infrastructure on our app. So you have a very single reference point to find this type of information. Then another area is gamification and social proof. So I think oftentimes sustainability knowledge is being put forward on a very serious note. We actually know in behavior science that we are much more receptive to engage and to receive information if it comes in a more playful manner. And so, for example, if you look on the streets, how many people are playing Candy Crush or catching Pokemon, right? And so we thought of how can we bring gamification also into a topic like adopting sustainable habits, so you have that very positive emotional connection as well. And then another part, we already spoke about the team, doing things together as a team, together with colleagues, right? So this is also a very good strategy.
And how have you seen adoption, and how has the tool changed as you've had more people adopt it to kind of keep evolving and closing that gap even further?
I think for us, really, every project that we run, every time we work with the community, be it more on the educational side, schools and universities, or be it more on the corporate side, we take this as an opportunity to learn and to evolve, right? So the technology part is maybe only one part of what we do, but the other part is really trying to better understand what motivates communities, what strategies work, how do you create engagement. That's a big challenge always, right? And so we have been refining these over the years. And I think one key part to this is also measurement, because oftentimes in behavior science, it's a bit of a softer topic and there's not maybe any hard measurements to hold ourselves accountable to. But we decided to incorporate KPIs so that we can actually see what is the expected outcome and are we working towards it? Are we able to achieve it or not? And then really learn from the scenario on hand.
Yeah. There's a few things there when you mentioned that, like learning, there's the learning from other people's behaviors, but also that education and awareness piece that has to kind of sit alongside it. And I'm curious to know what your own observations have been, where now you're dealing with communities, with corporates, across different groups of people, across different generations. What have you noticed as the differences in, if there are any, to people's attitudes to change and sustainability. And I'm curious to know what your learnings have been in that regard as you continue the journey.
Sure. It's an interesting question. So there was one study which really was quite eye-opening to me. So in 2022, OCBC published a public perception study called OCBC Climate Index, and that looked at sustainability awareness, adoption, and advocacy rates amongst different generations in Singapore. And what stood out to me, which was very surprising, is that actually the gap between awareness and advocacy amongst Gen Zs was the widest. So despite being the most environmentally conscious generation, actually their readiness to incorporate this into their day-to-day life was the lowest. And I think baby boomers or so are the ones doing the most.
Oh, wow. That's sort of surprising. One, from this idea that the more awareness we have, the more we're likely to do, when actually one alone doesn't shift. And then also, sort of anecdotally, I'd have expected it to be almost the opposite, right? Because we hear a lot of, the fact that climate change is being put on this new generation, and baby boomers are not as invested in it because they've done their bit. So tell me more about this, and what are your thoughts on this?
So I think the challenge that we have here is that we need to go beyond just informing youth and telling them what's the right thing to do, but we need to find ways to engage them more hands-on and also understand what are their values, their lifestyles, their concerns. And, we know from Gen Z, this is a generation that really values authenticity, transparency, impact. And instead of just giving them information top down, I think we need to find more opportunities for them to co-create solutions and do it in a way that's relevant and appealing to them. And then we will actually see that there's a very different sense of ownership to the solution. And so I feel, instead of just, like this analogy, like giving a person a fish, we have to teach them how to fish, and we have to maybe open the tools or like possibilities for them to also come up with solutions and to co-create things, or like systems that work for them.
Yeah. It makes me think back. We had a guest a few episodes ago called Imogen Short, and who is a storyteller, a writer, and she actually has her own mission to get storytelling front and center in corporate organizations. And that just sprang to mind because it's that sense of really having to engage at a much deeper level with people's emotions, with a sense of autonomy and agency over how to create the solution, not just that we need one in the first place. And it almost kind of resonates with both the benefits and the challenges that we see with social media, for example, where it's such an amazing platform to get engagement. But now the strive it's from someone of my generation, it feels that struggle for engagement is so affected by the fact that people don't have the attention spans now. We have to engage immediately. And actually, when you've got something that's so complex and nuanced as wholesale lifestyle and behavioral change, that's not really conducive to doing it in a quick, short snap. How do we kind of bridge that gap in a way?
I agree. I think it's an interesting one. And I think also when you talk about behavior change, it's actually something that really takes time. And when you look at the topic of sustainability, you have to have a very long-term view in this. So unfortunately, a lot of these, or even problems we face in today's world, are kind of really, issues that we need to invest, like with a long-term mindset. And I think this is something that unfortunately has been a little bit forgotten, even in the business world, where it's really about like short-term returns rather than that kind of long-term lasting business growth or building foundations and stuff like that.
Yeah, that does seem to be such a perennial problem, but also it's a really good reminder, actually, for any of the people out there that are listening in that are also trying to take on these massive challenges, right, of climate change, it's inclusion, behavioral change. These are really huge problems, and sometimes it's easy to get downhearted when you don't have the immediate metrics and the really pretty PowerPoint deck to get, X thousands, millions of dollars of investment from someone to pursue that. We actually really need to have a sustainable approach to actually addressing sustainability. How do you navigate that, Carolyn? Because when we talk about the status quo and the status quo bias, there is a certain image that springs to mind when we think of the startup founder. There's a certain image that springs to mind when we think of that eco warrior. And you've struck me, and your life story has been one that was actually just driven by the impact, and you might operate in a different way to that. How do you personally navigate that bias yourself, and how do you manage your business sustainably in a way for you that keeping in mind, what are your tips for keeping in mind that these are long-term goals? This is about chipping away, and the metrics need to be adjusted accordingly.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting question. I think for me personally, it was always about understanding that what I'm embarking on is a journey, and the journey is as important as the destination. So I think as a founder, you oftentimes have like an idea of what you want to achieve. So in my case, I was really strong about I want to drive behavior change to increase the adoption of sustainable habits in our society. But the how to do this is actually constantly evolving. So instead of going on this very fixed model, I think what helped me is to try to keep it dynamic and really adjusting based on real world dynamics, experiences, and feedback that we get from the communities that we engage in, right? Every time, there's so much learning and so much like pivoting along the way. But as long as you have your mission and you know the why, I think for me, it doesn't make me feel anxious because I know I'm still on the right path, right? And then I think another thing that's very important when we are on this journey is that it's not whatever we are doing is not an isolated effort. And even our work at Saskin is just like a puzzle piece in a bigger picture. And I think what's very important is to really build strong connections with a broad ecosystem of partners who share the vision, who work alongside you on their own puzzle pieces, and see this as a collective endeavor. And I think then also our ability to drive the change is much better. And there's always that support system around you that, can help you out as well.
Yeah. What I take away from that is almost that the more important thing when you're doing your work is to have that longer term value proposition that you're constantly working towards, as opposed to necessarily the immediate, I need to meet these immediate goals. And then if I don't, you're almost setting yourself up for failure when you don't meet that goal. That feels like a penny drop moment for me, because I know that, and particularly I think in that corporate space, I'm surrounded by people that, we've got our quarterly goals, our annual goals, and we're all about these kind of KPIs in such a rigid way that it's easy to lose sight of the longer term picture. It comes across then the fact that you continue to resonate this sort of positivity and very calm demeanor over the fact that exactly where you're going and you're getting there, despite there'll be pivots, and that's all part of the journey. What has it taken for you, or what do you think your qualities are that make that something that's almost become habitualized for you? Because you also did come out of that corporate space where you would have been, I'm sure, subject to that same, where here are the KPIs, this is what you got to do. I'm really curious, sort of asking for a friend to do with my podcast guest. But what are those times, or have there been those times when you have had to pick yourself up and go, gosh, is this worth all the effort? And what has been that magic? piece of.
Of course, I think everybody has that. I think one thing that helps me is that I'm an optimist. So for me, the cup is always rather half full than half empty. So that was helpful. And I guess with all of the challenges that you may face, I came to the point that I realized I'd rather do this in a day-to-day basis and try and tell myself I tried to do what I can than just going on with my day-to-day corporate life and basically sitting there, maybe maybe having a good life, but in a way, in my point of view, wasting time because I feel so strongly about that mission and about doing something in that space. And another thing I think that really, as I mentioned earlier, picked me up many times is to see that I'm not the only one in this space. I'm not the only one doing it, and really having a close circle of people who support you, who uplift you, who you can be real and share, like your experiences as well. And so then it feels much more easy to bear, and also it's much more positive to do this together.
It sounds like so much heart and real purpose drives what you do. And
for me, at least, I guess everybody is different, but that's really deep down what makes me, wake up every morning and try again, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but actually that is quite a common thread between people I've spoken to in this podcast, people that I speak to that are also in that, the people and culture change space, a lot of whom, and particularly at my generation level, who maybe have done, had a corporate career and then are shifting into something else, that there is really something just internal that drives them. And actually, when you sort of put that energy out there, kind of the people will sort of fall into place, and that next person that just gives you that next little bit of energy when you might be on a little bit of a low point, that just kind of keeps you going. And in a way, it sort of speaks to the ways in which we reach out to say, the Gen Z in the Singapore data study that you shared, of going, actually, we can afford to really listen to what we feel and propel ourselves, and then use all of our skills and the things that we are very good at doing in order to help us be that person that we want to be. And it's actually quite a powerful driver for behavioral change in and of itself, if you can say that actually, even when it feels like it's against the status quo, if you give it a try, if you experiment, see for yourself whether actually that you still seem to be able to get up in the morning doing those things or not. And then at least and then you don't have to be carrying on in the path that you're going on in, thinking, oh, is there something better somewhere else, or could I be doing something differently? So I really get a lot of energy from hearing and seeing people sort of embody that, Carolyn. And now look, a question to round us off, a question that I ask each of my guests to end this podcast on. As you know, the title of the podcast is Unbiased, and of course this topic fitted straight in. But in the move from judgment to curiosity, I really believe that we ought to have more questions than answers, and those are the things that drive us as well. And so I'd really like to hear from you. Can you leave us with a question that you think we should be asking more of in our day-to-day lives?
Yeah, sure. I think my question links to what we discussed just now, and is how can we remain resilient and true to our values even in the face of adversity? And I think when you look at the market developments, political changes, things around us right now, probably a lot of people can resonate to it. So I think when it comes to sustainability, it's really also about asking ourselves, how can we shift our mindset from short-term gain into long-term value creation? And so how can we stay true to ourselves and keep our moral compass intact as we are on this journey, so that we always have this prioritization for people, planet, profit, purpose, and stay true to our past. So this is really the bigger question that I have.
Wow, such a powerful question for everyone to just ponder on, to spend a few minutes pondering on each day. How can we stay true to our values in our day-to-day lives?
Exactly.
I love it. Thank you so much for taking the time out, Carolyn. I'm so glad that our
Thank you,
paths
Darcy.
crossed. And I know that your energy has driven me on when I have felt like a bit lost in the world of behavior change. So I really look forward to seeing Sustain go from strength to strength as you.
Thank you, Darcy. It was really lovely talking to you. Great chat. Thanks again for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. I derive so much energy from speaking to such inspiring guests and having really meaningful and challenging conversations. If you felt the same way, my ask of you is to please subscribe to this podcast, either here or wherever you download your podcast content from. Unbiased is a labour of love for me, and the impact that these perspectives have depend on reaching as many eyes and ears as possible. So your support is invaluable. Until next time, stay curious.